Okay, well, why don't we begin? Hello, everyone. I'm Brian Behlendorf. I'm Executive Director of Hyperledger, and I'm really glad to be kicking off a 5-week series of panels and conversations to commemorate the 5th anniversary of the launch of the Hyperledger project. In fact, December 17th, 2015 was the date of the first press release that went out to everybody announcing the formation of the Hyperledger project. And in that time, a lot of amazing things have happened, and we've really become a mature and interesting project. And so we really wanted to reflect the broad community that we've pulled together, and so we've put together a series of panels to explore the different facets of those. The first panel actually starts tomorrow at about the same time. It'll just kind of be a retrospective of the first 5 years by a couple of our core participants who've been with the project since the beginning. So please join us for that. We will drop the link to the full series and post on the website in chat, as well as it's on the Hyperledger website. But to start off, we thought it would be fun to get a little bit nostalgic, but also think a bit about the future by having a real casual fireside conversation. And one of the real joys of being on this project has been connecting with journalists and reporters and others in the media industry who have been very hungry to understand not only how the technology works, but what can we really accomplish with it. And very few of those have approached the level of rigor and finesse and nuance that Michael Del Castillo has. Michael, thank you for joining us here today. And yeah, let's talk about the last 5 years of Hyperledger. First off, could you tell us a bit more about kind of yourself and your context with the project?
I'm excited that enterprise blockchain has survived 5 years and grown a lot. I did my first Bitcoin article back in 2011, believe it or not. And in 2015, I was still begging my editors to let me write about cryptocurrency. I still had to take every story that I wanted to write and ask for permission. But it was starting to get a little bit more acceptable in media outlets. And then in December 2015, I was first introduced to Hyperledger on a story at one of our competitors whose name shall not be mentioned. But they did a great coverage of what was called the Open Ledger project briefly, and then had sort of evolved into Hyperledger. And I literally changed gears that day, and I stopped what I was working on and I started writing about this new group. And I've been writing about it in a lot of ways ever since. But I think it's a cool backstory because, I know where I was at that moment, but I think it's really interesting to know where were you at that moment. So let's get things started just by talking a little bit about what was Brian Behlendorf doing on December 17th, 2015.
So I was, let me tell just a little bit about my background that led me to that point, because it was a little bit of an anomaly, I guess, when you look at what I've done in my career. So I was born in a small town called Burbank. No, I'm just kidding. As most people know, I've been
far back.
Maybe not that far back, but I've been involved for 25 years in one way or another with open technologies, right? With trying to make the web grow and work, and through the Apache project, which became the Apache Software Foundation, setting up really the first consortium around and open source around, the first nonprofit around open source software, right? But still doing that from a commercial point of view. Starting a couple of different companies and then deciding I wanted to really focus on what's the social impact of open source technology and the way that we can build these information systems that are more cooperative. And so I kind of left the company behind, joined the board of the Mozilla Foundation, a couple other groups, and went out and traveled quite a bit, and then started working on a presidential campaign. The Obama campaign, started serving at the White House in 2009 and 10. And then that led up to being CTO for the World Economic Forum. And through all that, trying to find ways for technology to seep into these conversations about how the world worked and how it should work, and being somewhat of an idealist, being driven by I want to make the world more fair and more just. but also a pragmatist. How do we do that today? What are the IT challenges today that can lead to that, right? How do we make room for people to be able to make money in that? And after that kind of career, I got a little bit exhausted, and I kind of needed to take a break, but then wanted to see what life was like in a very different angle. So a friend was starting a venture capital firm called Mithril. So said, well, I could park myself there for a while and kind of learn about the next couple.
Would you like to mention the name of that friend?
Well, it was Jay Royan, who is a partner at Mithril, and Peter Thiel is another partner there as well. So I was briefly part of the Thiel empire. And, in addition to looking at things like nuclear fusion and robotic surgery and all these other really cool domains, certainly paid attention to what was emerging out of the Bitcoin and blockchain ecosystem. Had lots and lots of pitches to invest early on in the companies around that. Couldn't really invest the funds money directly into the currencies, but I certainly paid attention to what was going on, and I was super skeptical. It was hard to separate out the token promoters and the fly-by-nights from the real substance, and also unclear where the defensible value was going to be created.
Where were you when you first read an article or were otherwise introduced to Hyperledger, and what was your first reaction?
So my first reaction, and this was me sitting there as a managing director at Mithril, kind of evaluating technologies and learning a lot about blockchain and Bitcoin, was, okay, this is where the ability to form a distributed ledger, the ability for all parties to be able to write to it and verify the integrity of those transactions, actually met up with the business realities of the problems that it could solve, right? Because even before that point, people have been talking about land titles and those sorts of things, but it got very much confused with burning CPU power and speculative financial instruments and that sort of thing. And I saw here a group of people saying, no, there's more prosaic ways of solving these kinds of challenges, and it doesn't mean disrupt all the things. It doesn't mean throw away the banks, get rid of the regulators, have this kind of crypto anarchist kind of point of view, that instead there's a way to improve the systems of the world rather than, kind of trying to throw them all away and try to start over. And so that appealed to me a bit. And I reached out to my friend Jim Zemlin, who had been running the Linux Foundation since very early on, and asked, is there a way I can help with this? And he said, well, why don't you show up at a couple of meetings? There were some face-to-face gatherings in New York City, one hosted by JP Morgan, another hosted by DTCC, where the technologists were coming together to talk about how do we kind of blend our different, the different things that we've built in kind of an R&D setting. IBM, I think IBM's project was called Openledger at first, with what Digital Asset had been building, with including a couple of early Bitcoin companies, and even Consensus was there early on. And so attended a few of those meetings, watched them, and yep.
Let's talk about what that early incarnation looked like. And so we're going to rephrase that. What did it look like as you started getting involved? So sort of metaphorically and maybe even literally walking into the offices for the very first time, sort of what was the lay of the land there? And what were your personal hopes for what the Openledger project, now the Hyperledger project, could accomplish?
So what was pretty clear early on was that there were, and still are, but even clear in 2015, there are legitimately a lot of different ways to build a distributed ledger system. There are differences of opinion on everything from consensus mechanisms to the right way to run smart contracts, to the configuration of them and the interfaces they expose to the outside world. And it became pretty important to us to really, try to figure out what's the balancing act there between meeting everybody's interests and goals with one piece of software versus potentially other approaches. And my experience on open source had been that it's really hard to scale an open source project to meet everybody's needs off of one code base. That often in complex environments, which even in 2015 blockchain had already become, having these different work streams, these different ideas in one melting pot was going to be a huge challenge. And there was a certain scalability of the development process that we needed to figure out, that the communities were already chafing against, because
there is only one Linux kernel, right? I mean,
this is true.
There was, you were growing up, and you were helping grow Hyperledger in this environment where there was a strong precedent at the Linux Foundation for a single code base. Was that the original vision? Was the original vision of Hyperledger that it would be a single code base?
I think there were some parties that joined that said, yeah, I would say actually even most of the ones in the early on, most of the participants early on said, you know, here's this code base IBM had made a lot of progress on. There were some good ideas on what digital asset had been building that could be brought in, and a few others. Let's see if we can piece these together into something whole. And Intel had also been working on their own kind of direction and brought it in, and it wasn't really clear that there was a nice way to blend those two efforts. There were some strong, not only architectural and programming language differences. You know, the Fabric team had been really focused on Go as the programming language. In 2015, it seemed like the right way to build services-based architecture. Still seems really interesting in that front. Whereas a lot of Sawtooth Lake, as it was called at the time, had been written in Python, had a very different architecture for when you forge consensus, was more closely associated with Nakamoto consensus, even though it used proof of elapsed time and some other functionality to avoid the proof of work issue. But just very differences of point of view. And so when I joined full-time in June of 2016, so I'd been watching this kind of community, advising some folks, trying to say to have some patience. You know, you can always work out these technical issues later on. I came to realize that the very first thing that I had to do as executive director was provide some clarity as to whether we were going to be about one code base or needed to make room for these other ideas. And I used that as the pretext to go out and talk to all the companies that had been signed on as members and introduce myself and say, guess what? First question of the day is, what do we do about this, right? And is there room out there? And certainly, meanwhile, the public blockchain community was continuing to innovate. That's where you started to see the birth of Neo and EOS and others. And there was this kind of Cambrian explosion, both on the public blockchain side and on others doing permission blockchains as well. And that was about the same year, 2016. You saw a couple of variants of Ethereum that were private launched, right? And others. And it just seems to me that this space—
in those early days, was there actual demand, or was there more of an instinct that that this technology should be applicable in other ways than just issuing digital assets? Were you sort of like building and hoping that people would come, or were there people knocking at the door saying, "Oh my God, please build this"? In the early days.
Well, I think there was a clear sense that there were use cases beyond digital assets that made sense. That the point of having chain code was to automate a whole bunch of business processes that could make the supply chain traceability was pretty clearly there. That simply having a common directory service that wasn't rooted at any one particular organization but was shared. But the way to automate certain business processes, I mean, all that was a clear part of the goal from the beginning. What I think, but it certainly had to prove itself. The concept of enterprise blockchain had to prove itself in the public mind. There wasn't a lot of demand yet for people to go, I've got this problem and I know blockchain can solve it for me, so we have to build something. We had to be, that also meant that as an open source project, we weren't stepping into a mature space and just kind of, reducing down 100 different variants into one common core. I mean, if you think about where Linux was in 1991, operating systems, Unix operating systems had existed for 25, 30 years at that point. The kernel, Linus's kernel, was intended to be a clone of, with slight variations off of other Unix platforms, right? So we weren't in that spot with enterprise blockchain in 2015. It was still a pretty young space. And so when I went out and talked to members about, do we want to be around a common core or distributed, or have a couple of different options here, the sentiment was it was probably worth mapping the landscape, to try to make sure that there's a couple of different approaches that are tried, and then let the market decide which one of those seems the most viable, seems the most interesting. Let the teams kind of cooperate and then kind of compete at the same time, and that the goal for Hyperledger as an overall organization should be to foster the best kind of environment for building these kinds of technologies and encouraging them to talk to each other. And that's about the time we dropped the project name and just went with Hyperledger as a community to help make it clear we're a collection of projects, and then eventually adopted the greenhouse metaphor to help people further understand, we're building some things here, some of which we'll be able to harvest, some of which might not turn out the way we expect.
Did you briefly go with an umbrella metaphor, if I remember correctly?
And I used it here as well. I mean, that's perhaps the more common term for things like the Apache Software Foundation, which is 300, 400 projects now. Every one of them as large or larger than the web server project, which started it. Obviously, GitHub has like millions of projects, if you want to think of it that way. But umbrellas are what we do have in the Linux Foundation in a couple of domains, like cloud computing with the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, or LF networking, or all these others where there's a family of related technologies under a common brand. And so that's a pattern that seems to scale pretty well, because that also gives you the chance to go out and explain the technology to the world, which the operating system world didn't need, right? Which even cloud computing kind of somewhat needed, but not really much. But in enterprise blockchain, there was really nobody else making the case at a business level, at a conceptual level for enterprise blockchain except us for the first few years.
So Hyperledger went out with a bang in December 2015 with founding members including Accenture, ANZ, Cisco, CLS, Credits, Deutsche Börse, Digital Asset Holdings, DTCC, Eris Industries, which has been rebranded, I believe, Fujitsu, IC3, IBM, Intel, JP Morgan, London Stock Exchange Group, Mitsubishi, R3, State Street, Swift, VMware, and Wells Fargo. So these are well-known companies. These are brands that got a lot of attention. And I remember shortly after you joined, and the first time we spoke was actually for an article I did at CoinDesk back in 2016, May. I think it was a month before you officially started, and we talked about some of your goals. And this was the era when all you had to do to get a headline was join a consortium. And whether or not it was Hyperledger or R3CEV, as it was called, or another sort of high-profile blockchain consortium, we just saw like a wave of big companies paying their membership dues or whatever it was they had to do to get involved and figure out what was going on. So I'd love to kind of get to that point in the development of Hyperledger, where there was just this explosion of interest. Mm-hmm. What was that like on the inside? Were you seeing a lot of leaders that you were sort of having to manage too many chefs in the kitchen? Was there one or two leaders and other people looking to follow? What was it like as we were on the outside watching just headline after headline after headline of these new big enterprises getting involved with Hyperledger and R3 and others?
Right. Well, let me start kind of at a personal level, which is, so I had not been part of the Linux Foundation until this project. I joined, right? And prior to that, as I mentioned, I'd had roles on some of these other foundations and such, but only as a volunteer, only as maybe a board member here and there, never full-time paid, and somewhat incredulous at the idea that I could actually convince companies to commit real dollars to go and help run not the development of the code, but the air traffic control around the stewardship of that. That was the kind of thing that I'd almost always written off as one of the prices you had to pay to run an open source project, was even though you're a developer, even though you'd love to do nothing more than add features all day, not only do you have to fix bugs, you have to think about the politics as well. And really joining the Linux Foundation and watching the other projects at the LF helped me realize, that there's separate and tremendous value that comes from running that air traffic control, and that corporations realize that value, and they're willing to put those dollars in to help that happen, even if they themselves aren't writing other code, because they want to see the optionality in the market. They want to make sure that if this is a technology platform they're committing to, that there is a plethora of companies who support them, that other people are making the same decision, that this is an industry movement, a standard, if you will, but a standard in software form, and not just one vendor who's kind of calling the shots, who might run out of money and might leave, or otherwise leave us high and dry. And so as this interest came in, the immediate thing that struck me was, well, wait, is this fake? Like, is this gonna like disappear and as quickly as it started, right? Is this driven as kind of a shadow of the ICO kind of movement, right? Where companies feel like, well, they can't buy tokens, but they can double down in this. How much is this driven by just a positive economy and not much more? And so we really said we have to focus on the value that we're delivering to our members in the consortium, that is partly in the value of these digital public goods that are being created, right? But also in the form of membership value as well. And that's when we realized that, combined with the fact that enterprise blockchain was kind of the runt of the litter. I mean, if you remember at consensus conferences and other places, you know, we'd get speaking spots here and there. People certainly love to turn to our members for booths and sponsorships and that sort of thing. But you know, the highlight, the keynotes, the attention was almost always on the ICOs and the public ledger stuff and the currency things. So we kind of had to fight for respect, and we realized we need to spend as many resources on establishing that the concept out there in a way that allows people to see the value of it, and do that in a vendor neutral way, or really a promotive of all of our members together. And that became kind of key for us. And so as I built the staff, I kind of evenly built them on both sides, one on the community management side for the developer communities coming together, and the other on marketing and communication and making sure people understood what we were building. And I think that really paid off well. And we've been able to keep a lot of those members who are just users of blockchain technology, who aren't necessarily contributors in, keep them as members of Hyperledger, I think, because of that value that we're creating.
Out of the gate there, and I think to some degree still today, enterprise blockchain organizations like Hyperledger are viewed by some as sort of anti-crypto. Like, you know, they're permissionless, you're permissioned. In the early days, there was even like talk about how enterprises were co-opting this technology that was made in basements by hackers, you know, trying to make the world a better place. And I think it's not a surprise that going to those events, you know, at least in the early days, you were kind of off in the corner. I think that I love a story that you told where there was some possible synergy there, where one of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency's biggest haters, Nouriel Roubini, you had a conversation with. And I don't know, you know, if I don't want to read too much into this, but perhaps it may be a bit of an opportunity to gain some support for permissioned blockchain that he was reluctant to give to public blockchains. Tell me a little bit about your interaction with Nouriel and how that went.
I thought it would. I mean, I saw him at a reception at Davos, as these things, I guess, start, but where he had been delivering all week kind of his anti-cryptocurrency tirades, and he's not wrong on some of them, but also, I mean, he's Dr. Doom is kind of a nickname for a reason, right? He tends to be very much the critic of technologies. And I walked up and said, you know, there is an angle to these technologies that is creating value for a large number of companies out there now, in a way that they're using the tech separate from proof of work, which has been part of his criticism, and frankly mine and a lot of people's, right? And separate from the speculative nature in that space. And he just didn't want to hear it, you know, and didn't you know, was like looking around for anybody else he could have a conversation with. And I was like, all right, fine, maybe someday.
Nevertheless, there was a point in the future when public blockchains would start to have a bit of a day within Hyperledger. So tell me a little bit about what that looked like behind the scenes.
Sure.
First of all, what was the first public blockchain to sort of officially touch the Hyperledger work, and sort of what was the politicking behind the scenes that was going on there?
Yeah. So pretty early on, I recognized that we needed to have something more intelligent than, hey, we're the non-crypto side, we're the scammy side or whatever. Because I also knew that there were smart people I respected who were spending a lot of their time and energy and attention on Bitcoin and Ethereum, and they wouldn't do that if there wasn't something real there. I mean, so the very first business trip I took wearing a Hyperledger hat was to it was to a conference in Shanghai that was the second Ethereum DevCon, as well as an enterprise blockchain event. And I was kind of there for the whole week. And so met Vitalik there, met Joe, met a lot of the other personalities in the Ethereum ecosystem, and spent a fair bit of time reading their technology documents, seeing how they worked as a community, and having a lot of respect for that. Very different from the impression I got from the Bitcoin crowd. All right. And I said, look, I'm not certain that they are the ones who have all this figured out. And there were very clear limitations to the use of what they were talking about building for enterprises, whether it was from transaction volume or simply data residency requirements or a separation of concerns that you always want in security settings. So but I said, I want to understand the space. I want to keep a communication open and see if there's any potential application for us. And it was actually the first conversation I was working with a group led by Bob Somerville, who was working for the Ethereum Foundation at one point, around potentially bringing the C++ port of the Ethereum client into Hyperledger and potentially allow it to talk other consensus mechanisms so it could be used on permission settings, but also in permissionless as well. And got very close. It would have required a reassignment of the license because it was licensed under the LGPL, and we've been pretty solid about the Apache license here, and very solid. I mean, that's as a single license, it gives us a chance to go to enterprises and say, you can embed this inside your products without any concern or worries. And that's been really core to us. But it would have required all 100 contributors to that C++ code base to sign their rights over, and all but a few did. And I don't want to embarrass anyone too much about saying who it isn't, but you can read some histories. It was let's just say somebody who had been paid by the Ethereum Foundation to write a lot of that code, who but kept the IP interest to themselves, and then decided to start a new company that perhaps viewed this old code as competitive. So again, it's out there, public domain. I'm too much of a diplomat to throw too many people under the bus, but everyone knows him, and his initials are GW. Moving beyond that, but I kept the relationship warm with the Ethereum Foundation, and a little bit later on, Monax, which used to be called Eris, they had a smart contract engine focused on Solidity smart contracts that they were actually using with Tendermint as the consensus mechanism. And it had been open source, but they felt that, hey, there'd be some value here to having a wider audience for it and potential other collaborators. So they brought it in as a project, and that got a bit of pickup. It was still very much focused on permission blockchain settings, but it was all right. It was like a flag in the ground, and allowed us to credibly go to people and say, we have a very open mind, and we want to recognize where there's good value, where there's good engineering happening out there, and maybe there's a way for things written for the public blockchain to also work on permission blockchains and back and forth, maybe making this more of a spectrum than a dichotomy. And then finally, we had kept a really good relationship with Consensus and kept the door open there. They were actually part of the original announcement, original cohort, at least when I joined, and then things seem to go very, very separate, in terms of public versus Hyperledger. And then they came back around last year, joined as a member, in fact, joined as a premier member, which is really awesome, and brought into the community.
A quick little side note for anyone who's paying attention, wants to go do some research. There was some brief interaction with Ripple in the early days that didn't really pan out to anything, right? And then it kind of came back later.
Yes, just to finish that last thought. So Bezu, Hyperledger Bezu, which is now both a public blockchain and a permission blockchain client, full client, is now a tier 1 project inside Hyperledger, and that kind of has now brought us back really closely. With regards to companies like Ripple and R3, R3 was part of that launch announcement. Ripple was very early in there as well, and Ripple did bring in some technology to do kind of coordinated payments between XRP, Bitcoin, and other ledgers that we were hoping could become something more generalized, Hyperledger Quilt, but didn't quite get that takeoff, which is fine. Again, we're a greenhouse. Some of these projects will thrive, others will, perhaps not, but it's still very much alive. But Ripple and R3 and others, part of this early days kind of recognition of all these companies in the room, even if they all have very different ideas about how blockchain technology should work, caused me to also realize we needed to be thinking about components in this space that can talk to multiple ledgers, right? That can be critical to building bridges between them. So Quilt was the first attempt at that. We have a project now called Hyperledger Cactus that I think is an even better interoperability play between these kinds of networks, and it already supports Fabric, Bezu, Corda, and Quorum. It's still version 0.3, so still pretty early. I don't want to oversell it, but it's something where anyone interested in interop between permission blockchain networks, we'd really encourage them to come check it out.
One of the things that first got my attention about not just Hyperledger, but blockchain generally speaking and open source software, that it was one platform that was strengthened by competitors working together.
Yeah.
That by the very definition, there had to be multiple counterparties, and the efficiencies were only achieved if those counterparties all agreed to work together, quite literally. And I think that maybe naively, I thought I was among those people that was imagining a sort of Frankenstein of code that, would make every developer happy and that everybody could agree to use, and there would be infinite efficiency across all networks. Obviously, that's not quite happening. But what I think is really interesting is that there has been a sort of consolidation of ideas in a sense, where it started off with just permissioned blockchains, and then permissionless blockchains kind of started to dabble, and Besu came out. And then on a different category, I remember coming across a white paper years ago written by IBM talking about issuing tokens on Fabric. And I don't think they wanted reporters to see that, because I got them on the phone and they did everything they possibly could to keep a story from happening about issuing tokens on Hyperledger Fabric. Nevertheless, this is actually something that we're starting to see, which I think is really fascinating, where this ability that was sort of popularized on public blockchains and sort of they didn't want to talk about on the permission blockchains that you could issue tokens is now kind of becoming a thing again. And we've got, I'm looking at Fab Token, using Hyperledger Fabric to issue tokens, and founding member R3 has some token abilities. Are you seeing a future where we're seeing an increase of, or a merging of these two worlds, stuff that was previously only done on public blockchains happening on permission blockchains, to the point where they almost the differences kind of blur?
Sure. Well, I certainly do credit to the public blockchains for formalizing the idea of a token, right? The things like the ERC20 definition in the Ethereum ecosystem did a lot to help people understand that this is a thing that can be thought of conceptually separately from the underlying ledger. Previous to that point, people thought there was kind of a one-to-one correlation between a token and a ledger, as the Bitcoin network, or it was, the EOS network or whatever. And instead it turned out, and I think some people realized this early on, and now it's obvious with stable coins, you can have a lot of mix up there. You could have a lot of different tokens running on Ethereum. You could have tokens on permission blockchains, that sort of thing. And that realization has come around just at the time when central banks have realized this is digitizing the flow of value and the automation of the essential processes between central banks and the tier one banks inside of any country, as well as the international banks that deal a lot with currency exchange and payments across borders and that sort of thing, can bring a lot of operational efficiency. And even tokenizing things like securities. I mean, DTCC, who has been a part of Hyperledger since that beginning, since that first thing, their goal was always to move their core transaction processing systems that they use to track all the private securities and public company securities around the world on behalf of Wall Street banks, on behalf of the security or securities trading organizations out there, to move that from a mainframe-driven kind of central database to a a permissioned but decentralized one, even they were thinking, well, these are fungible assets. These are tokens, right? These are things that should be exchanged, and we can keep the ledger clear, but the parties themselves should be able to move them without needing to involve us, right? So to some degree, we're talking about semantics here, and what people perhaps were nervous about calling tokens in 2017 and 18, because of the sense of, oh, I'll do that and I'll get the SEC on my shoulders, to something where it can stand a little bit more separate is a pretty welcome change, because it allows us to kind of get past some of that. And I think even the word blockchain does sometimes prove a barrier to talking about the deployments of things out there. Some organizations use the term multi-party systems to even more generically describe these technologies, and it might come back.
I do. I want to just highlight to the audience that there is an opportunity to post questions in the Q&A channel on Zoom. If you'd like to start doing that now, Brian and I will keep talking for about another 10 minutes or so, and then I'll do my best to go through any questions that you have. So on that front, Brian, of permission networks starting to issue tokens and seeing a sort of merging of functionalities. I want to call out some code bases in the past that have said they were going to open source. There's been a lot of promise, maybe to get goodwill. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but permission blockchain networks that have acquired users, in some cases high-profile users, and I'll just throw, and I'll speak concretely here. DTCC's code of choice, Axoni, for its implementation, has said for years that it would eventually open source, and they have yet to do that. And there are some other higher and lower profile code bases that have said they were going to open source but have not done so. As you look at the rate that code bases were contributed to Hyperledger in the early days and where it's at now, is the window closing for these codes to open source, or will we continue to see code open sourcing forever?
So, the effect that Linux had on the operating system market, right, was pretty profound. I mean, during the 1990s, Linux was really just establishing its footing, but it was already stepping into some mission critical roles in the enterprise, kind of under everyone's budgetary radar. In fact, IBM did this study in 1998 where they pulled their top 100 company CIOs and asked them, how many of you are using Linux in your enterprise? And like 2 of them raised their hand and said they are. But then they asked line level engineering managers and IT guys inside those 100 companies, are you using Linux? And like 90% of them said yes, because it was running on, mail servers and file servers and DNS servers and these other things that didn't bubble up into a purchase order. So the CIO never knew about it, right? Because it was never a budget request. It was just things that the IT team went and deployed. And then during the 2000s, that's when you started to see companies that had their own proprietary flavors of Unix, start to realize that the engineering cost of supporting those efforts and the marketing costs of convincing a customer to port their application to Solaris or port it to HPUX or even to AIX, IBM's version of Unix at the time. I mean, there were like 25, 30 of these out there, was an uphill battle and getting harder to do, rather than those companies supporting Linux on their hardware. And Linux made it easy by having modules that you could adapt to any CPU, could adapt to any kind of storage device. So why not tell people, build this to Linux and then we'll support you on our hardware? A much easier story than to go on their own. And you see this pattern repeat in other domains. As that space matures, that kind of Cambrian explosion does whittle down, partly through market forces, but also through technologies that are more adaptable, kind of winning the day over the ones that might have some differentiated value by being different. And so there are still proprietary operating systems today, right? Obviously, Windows and Mac are pretty big. And there's also still proprietary embedded operating systems or server class operating systems. But it's really hard today, if you're a startup, to introduce a new operating system and have a whole lot of unique value proposition in doing so. And if you're somebody who's had an embedded operating system today for a while, you're probably considering how to port your users over to Linux and move the next step up into what Clayton Christensen called the law of conservation of interesting profits, which was as the lower tier gets disrupted, move up the stack and provide differentiated value up above. So there, at the beginning of Hyperledger, arguably we had an open door to bringing in more different kinds of ledger platforms with different points of view than Fabric had and Sawtooth had and Bezu and others. But the window is probably closing insofar as a lot of these other platforms don't have a uniquely different point of view. Yeah. Especially if they're ones that started as forks of Ethereum or speak, another interesting angle on this is DAML. If your platform supports DAML and your users are on DAML, the distributed asset markup language, which runs perfectly fine on Fabric, also runs on Bezu, why not? What's the true value that you're providing by being a different ledger underneath? And if there's none, not only should you consider open sourcing it, you might even just consider porting your customer base over to platforms that have better traction and moving your value prop up the stack.
So I think it is interesting that, obviously giving away your code is a massive business proposition. I mean, you have to really understand how to capitalize on that. You have to really understand the battle for brain share and users that understand your technology and, how that can turn into revenue 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, or 100 years from now. And it's not 100% agreed. Some people think that the seeds of open source's own failure are in open source. And that maybe, it's better just to have 10 elite coders that know how to use your software perfectly than to have 1,000 sort of dabblers or other people. It's interesting, though, that regardless of the business decisions that are made, there is something that I think you like to call free riders. And I think that the free rider phenomenon, I think, is another interesting problem that Hyperledger has had to attack that sort of helps paint the picture of what the future might or might not look like. First of all, what is a free rider? How prevalent is free riderdom in Hyperledger? And is it something that you're worried about?
So the free rider problem, this is something that every open source project kind of deals with, and is the other side of the coin from the fact that, we use licenses that give away the code very freely. And, in most cases, the GPL and copyleft licenses aside, do not require any give back, even when you go off and build this into your own commercial products and sell and make money from it. And it's, there's a moral basis for why I really resonate with that, which is I'm much happier giving you a gift than giving you a thing, but then telling you have to give me back a thing, right? I think for a lot of developers who are naturally, kind of both proud of what they've built, but also humble about how they've built it. That sense of no compulsory give back is actually also a safe space to operate from. And the presumption there is that if you're getting code from me and you start using it and building it, you're going to find a bug. You're going to need to fix that bug. And it's easier for you to get that fixed by asking me if it's the right fix and submitting it upstream into my code. And then we start working on this together, right? That's the idealistic take. And it's the basis of Apache. It's the basis of all these other communities out there. And even if only 1/10 of the companies who get value drive something back, it's a numbers game. Your hope is that enough people adopt it, that 1/10 of those will feed back in. And that's certainly the case in things like cloud computing, where, every company doing enterprise software or deploying anything is using containers, they're using the cloud. So naturally 1/10 of those, or even 100th of those, is going to be a massive contributor community. The blockchain community is still pretty small. It's still, describable on the order of thousands of core developers across projects rather than tens or hundreds, or thousands of active developers, I'd say. And so on each of our projects, they range from having, 10 to 20 kind of pretty active full-time developers to one, right? And there's a risk when it gets too small that those projects, they might be interesting and thriving, but they might not be resilient. You know, if that one person has to be reassigned or even gets hit by a bus, you know, we call it the bus factor in open source projects, that there's a risk that project you might not see other developers rise up to become core maintainers on that code. And in one case with a Hyperledger Composer, the community made a very difficult decision, which was, here's a project that had a lot of active users, but the core developers, who did all work for IBM, so I will grant that, but the core developers said, you know, this was designed to be a prototyping tool, but most of the users out there, because they liked it, have turned it into, or tried to use it as an authoring tool for production networks and kind of a way to not have to get into the code, and that wasn't their intent. And they said, we'd rather work on better SDKs and integration with other IDEs to get people what they want, rather than trying to take this prototyping tool into a direction it's not meant for. And so they shifted their focus. We asked the Composer users, do any of you want to become core maintainers? And the problem is, when you have software designed for beginner users, or even things like, say, Mozilla Firefox, right? You know, it's designed for, you know, consumers. It's really hard to pull those folks into becoming users. That 1 in 10 is probably more like 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000, right? And so, not seeing developers coming in there, we didn't want to have a project in the greenhouse that was live, but didn't have anyone home if you had a question, or wasn't cutting new releases or keeping up with where Fabric was going, Fabric 2.0, that sort of thing. So that was where we collectively as a community made a difficult decision to archive that project. The code is still available, but we're not directing attention to it in quite the same way we were. Even though it's good code, even though the users liked it, you know, this is one of those things, those tough decisions you have to make when you're managing that portfolio and dealing with a lot of new people and bound to the community. And now there's other better ways to onboard people climbing that learning curve with Fabric, but it's missed, you know.
There was the original vision, as I understand, of a single code base, for a lot of reasons which you already elucidated, that wasn't technically possible and maybe not politically possible. I don't know. But it's interesting to hear you talk about a tiny little bit of consolidation, that there was definitely a phase of growth, and there was almost a race to be among the first to contribute. I presumably underneath the hopes of getting, you know, early developers to learn how to use your software. And I don't know if it's fair to say it's plateaued, but it's definitely slowed. And there is a bit of consolidation, as you just indicated. Is that going to continue? I mean, is it possible that at some point, you know, interoperability plugged into interoperability becomes just a single code base again, like was the original vision?
Well, I don't think we ever get back to a single code base. I do want to say first, there's the pace of new projects joining, you know, as top level projects, we've kind of put a throttle on that a little bit, just because, you know, one thing that we found is as a better approach is encouraging projects to join Hyperledger Labs, which is our kind of lower threshold, lower criticality, more easy place to get some code started. Maybe it's the result of a prototype, a weekend hack. Maybe it's something that somebody isn't sure if others find value in, but let's put it here. It doesn't get the promotion that we do for our main projects, and it doesn't necessarily out of the chute get its own logo, that sort of thing. But it is all under an open source license. It is all built publicly. And what we've found is that starting projects there, and as they mature, promoting them up to projects like Cactus and Avalon that both started as labs-driven projects is a better way to get started. And so we've seen a lot of interesting things happening there this year. There's a project there to do a central bank digital currency defined using the token taxonomy framework, for example. There's another called the blockchain automation framework. Both of those could become top level projects, as we call them, over time, but we're taking the time to build the community and build like a more solid code base there first before graduating them up. So in that way, we've gotten more mature, and maybe slowing down in that way isn't a bad thing. And I think we're all realizing too, like our goal is not to be GitHub. You know, our goal is not even to be the Apache Software Foundation. We want to be a well-curated portfolio of core infrastructure blockchain projects, and allowing for optionality, allowing for some competition between those, but also looking at what can we work on together. So that's where projects like Ursa, which is about unifying the cryptographic routines underneath all the other projects as a way to make it easier to adopt new routines, make it easier to validate that there are fewer bugs in that code than you might otherwise have if you had 3 different implementations of the same idea. That's the kind of direction I see the community going in, is modularization, componentization, and then growing some of these labs projects a little bit more organically.
And I think so. We do have some great questions coming in from developers that I want to be sure that we get a chance to go to. But very quickly, just with an eye to the future, I wanted to ask if you could kind of expand a little bit on that modularity concept that you were just talking about, specifically as relates to the newly revealed open governance network. As I understand, there is a bit of modularity there. I could be mistaken. Could you just kind of walk us through what is this new thing, in case I'm not the only one that hasn't had a chance to read in detail yet, and what might it look like in the future?
So we've been working a little bit this year on helping address what people have cited as one of the big challenges with getting the permission blockchain networks, not necessarily bootstrapped, but flying in production, which is the governance structure for these blockchain initiatives, where, if you've pulled together 10 different companies and, a lot of them are competitors with each other, and if you were bootstrapping that production permission blockchain network off of either a single vendor or, say, a central actor in that ecosystem, there's always going to be participants going, well, I'm not going to put my real transactions there, my real assets there, until I know that this has a degree of independence, whether it's technology vendor independence or independence from my main competitor. I don't want them running the blockchain network, right, is always a concern. And it's a completely valid concern, because we do all these things to try to be more decentralized than we otherwise would be. If we're happy letting one company run the central database or all of the nodes on the blockchain network, we might as well do something that's more like Airbnb or PayPal, right, than something shared. And so we've been working to put together both a conceptual model as well as some specific examples of having the Linux Foundation serve as a governance home for these kinds of blockchain networks. We're working on 2 of those right now, both in the regulatory space around reporting, to one around pharmaceuticals, the other around insurance reporting, using Hyperledger technologies in both cases, although really conceptually, these will be independent projects. Those will be sister projects to Hyperledger. And frankly, if they would rather use Corda or rather use Quorum, they should feel free to, right? And so this is modular with respect to Hyperledger. They might even come up with code that could be upstreamed into Hyperledger over time. But they're really about, in the same way that we form consortia to answer the software question, how do we build that software together? This is about how do we piece that software together, plus legal constraints, plus human governance into a functioning network. And so we do have a blog post up about that. I'll try to drop the link in the chat so people can get it. But and we'll be announcing kind of the first couple of these before the end of the year.
Thank you, Brian. I've got a question here from an Ethereum developer who wants to go to the dark side and enter the Hyperledger ecosystem. Andrew asks, are there any example repos I can try to learn from setting up a private chain to integrating Messenger and event systems like Kafka and RabbitMD to deploying a smart contract onto it?
Sure. So Hyperledger Bezu is one place to get started. And the website for that project will has a list of tutorials, both written kind as well as video, that you could watch to kind of get bootstrapped to understand how to stand up a Bezu node, how to stand up a network of nodes, how to write Solidity smart contracts and deploy it to Bezu, to that permission network, as well as how to stand Bezu up as a public chain node. And it's one of the 3 or 4 top clients software for the Ethereum public chain, as well as the Ethereum classic chain. So start with that. And then when I'm not quite clear on where I would recommend going in terms of integration with Kafka and RabbitMD. But the Bezu developers hang out on the Hyperledger chat system. It's just simply chat.hyperledger.org. We have to do everything slightly differently. So instead of using Slack, we use something called Rocket Chat for the community. But that's a good place to show up and start asking some questions. And it does support different consensus mechanisms. So if you're looking at using Kafka as the consensus mechanism for Bezu, that's where I would go, as to where the core developers hang out on chat, and ask them there about where to potentially get started in writing your own consensus module for Bezu.
And Kyle asked if you could clarify something that you said earlier about some people who choose to use the term multi-party system instead of blockchain. What might be the thinking or necessity behind having to use that different wording?
Sure. Well, it's not necessarily a more accurate term. It's a little bit more generalized term. I mean, and to some degree, the internet is a multi-party system, right? But it's a multi-party system that works. In fact, due credit to the domain name system for being something that's not based on a blockchain, but is about as close as you get to a decentralized approach to solving a big consistency challenge, right? And so there are companies out there where if you say the word blockchain as in the name of your project, or you're asking for money, and somebody's going to look at that and do a Google search and see all this kind of alarming kinds of content, and their first reaction might be, whoa, this sounds weird. I don't want to touch it, right? So in some cases, it is a marketing challenge more than anything else, and potentially as well, though, it's a term that might encompass other Web3 technologies like IPFS, for example. IPFS at its core is a DHT, not so much a blockchain, and yet it's being used in a lot of blockchain projects. So if we were to have IPFS related projects inside Hyperledger, which could happen, it wouldn't be appropriate to call IPFS a blockchain technology. And so expanding our scope in that way might be on the table, might be something we'd look at. And it really does come down to what's something of value that we can do in this space, right? What do our members want? What does the broader community want? And I think we'll see where the term blockchain goes in 2021.
One last question from the audience, then I want to wrap things up with a closing question. So this is from Angela Maria. Oh, really quick, before I get to Angela Maria, someone in the audience, Michael, I won't use your last name. I asked you to clarify your question in private. If you could clarify that, I'll do my best to answer it. But while we're waiting for Michael to clarify, Angela Maria writes that she would like to ask whether there are plans, specific discussion within Hyperledger on an open source blockchain as a service project. Are there any plans for Hyperledger itself to host or organize an open source blockchain as a service project, or might that already exist?
So one important kind of thing that we agreed early on, and again, this was me asking the community to make sure that we were clear on this, was that Hyperledger was going to be about software. And it was really going to be up to you to deploy it to build a network, right? And that way we could avoid all the complexity around not having a mainnet, not having a coin. That's when I said there'd be no hypercoin. I still say that. And I have to apologize to my staff for not making them filthy rich. But we're always about being that software that people go off and build into their own networks, and that'll continue to be true. But there can be better software, I believe, for helping those launching blockchain as a service offerings. Today we've got a lot of the major vendors kind of incorporating Fabric into their own kind of larger management systems, whether that's IBM into IBM Blockchain Platform or Azure into their kind of consoles, and that's going to make sense. But if we really want to have lots of other companies out there offering these kinds of things, companies like DigitalOcean, for example, or others, having more automated ways, or even for vendors or end user organizations with their own IT staff, having more automated ways to manage that seems like a really good idea. And I think that's the goal of the blockchain automation framework project that we have in Hyperledger Labs. So definitely encourage you to check that out.
I promised when I framed this last question, I did not originally intend to do it to plug my own work, but I'm going to on accident. So we are currently, when I say we, I mean Forbes is currently in the middle of its third year of putting together the Blockchain 50 list of billion-dollar companies that are taking blockchain seriously. For anyone who's considering nominating, you have to be $1 billion or more. We've gotten a lot of enthusiastic nominees that did not meet that criteria. But one of the things that I've loved about doing that list for now 3 years, is sort of identifying some trends over time. And without a doubt, the percentage of live, active production blockchain applications is increasing notably. In fact, give you a little inside information here for anyone's here. My guess is that roughly 90% of our list members this year or next year will have live applications, as opposed to our first year where it was kind of the opposite, where it was 10% live and 90% POC. But with the increased number of live projects, there's, I think, a decreased number of total projects. As POCs kind of go dormant, or the use case doesn't prove out, there's just not demand for it. So the total mature projects are increasing, but the total actual project is decreasing. Is this a positive or a negative thing for Hyperledger? Like, is Hyperledger doing okay? I want to get to the business question here. Like, is Hyperledger doing okay financially? Will we still see Hyperledger around in 5-10 years?
So let me answer that last question first. So we are absolutely okay. We are here. This has been a hard year for lots of different companies, and consortia are kind of expect to be last on the list to be bought into, and kind of first on the list to be cut when budgets go down, right? And so we've certainly had some churn this year, as we do every year. But we have our core staff. We've got a mission to deliver, and we're not a for-profit company. We scale ourselves up or down based on the market demand for this, right? And many open source projects at the Linux Foundation grow, and then they reach a point of stability because the software is doing what people expect it to, and there's needs for upkeep and maintenance and new ideas to come in from time to time. And we'll right size to that. And with the launch of these governance networks and some other projects at the Linux Foundation, we'll see this blockchain concept kind of permeate other projects at the Linux Foundation, and probably end up with more people over time working on it than just at Hyperledger. So we're all good, and we don't have VCs kind of breathing down our neck wanting a 10x return in 5 years or anything like that. So we can survive, and it's really through our membership that we're able to do this. And then secondly, I think the economy did affect the capacity out there for proofs of concept. Certainly made anybody who was doing that kind of less interested in pushing out press about it, right? So I think there's still lots of experiments that we're not hearing about. We hear about it on one-on-one phone calls with our members, but they often are kind of hesitant to even do a blog post or other kind of PR around it because they want to see how it turns out. But you're right that other networks are doubling down and increasing. On TradeLens, for example, which everyone loved to kind of beat up on because it was very Maersk-centric at the very beginning, they now have 175 different organizations participating directly on it. 50% of the global container shipping fleet is represented on the platform. 1.6 billion transport events posted so far on the network, and 14 million documents. So like, it's getting real use. But these things are like icebergs. You see the very top of it, and underneath is where the mass of it. And that stuff, there's not really an incentive for folks to be incredibly public about, because they're not hyping a coin. They're not driving some other kind of, other interest in like widely talking about it. So sometimes getting stories out from our members is one of the biggest challenges of what we have to do. But we see it, we feel it, and it's powering through this pandemic. And I think in 2021, things are going to be really amazing on that front.
So last question, future focused. You just reminded me as you were talking about TradeLens's over 170 members. As we've seen an increased attention being paid to zero knowledge proofs, this technology layer that can sit on top of public blockchains and give them privacy that is sort of comparable in many ways to a permissioned blockchain. Are we moving towards a world where all of these permissioned blockchains are going to be done on public blockchains with new technologies like zero knowledge proofs providing the same privacy, or will there always be a need for a permission system?
I think there's a need, very much like there's a need for subnetting in networks, where not all of our traffic between like my home server and my laptop goes over the public internet, right? Or even we see VPNs out there quite a bit, because good security exists in layers. And it's certainly possible. I mean, we've seen this from the beginning that anchoring transactions or anchoring checksums into the public blockchains on a periodic basis can help provide that same degree of trust and integrity that the permission ledger would have if it were operating entirely on the public chain, but give you the speed and adaptability and regulatory compliance and data residency requirements and all those things that are a lot of the big drivers for the permission blockchains. So I think they'll exist in resonance with each other and find a way to coexist that provides value to the enterprise, because that's what it is at the end of the day. But it's been heartening to see the public ledger community evolve from where it was 5 years ago to where it is now, which is potentially a substrate for a lot of these kinds of activities.
I know I've already told you twice. Last question. Michael just got back with a clarification on the question he had asked earlier. So let me make sure I get this right. So Hyperledger Besu version 4, what will it look like? What will be its top key features?
Okay, great. And yeah, I know we're past time, so I'll simply say we leave it up to the individual projects to decide what direction they want to take the code base in. They do that publicly. They have a couple different processes for doing that, typically issuing RFCs, calls for comments on different proposals and that sort of thing. And being decentralized in this way is actually a key part of how we scale and how we work. So I would turn you over to the Besu community, ask you to check out the website for Besu, the wiki space for it. And if you have questions, to join the chat channel for them. And I know they're very open to it. And one of their biggest things on Besu is that they track the public blockchain technology roadmaps very closely. So alignment with Ethereum 2.0 and all those things is super important for them.
Awesome. Brian, everyone at Hyperledger, thank you so much for putting this together. Looking forward to seeing the coming up events over the next weeks. I believe that you and I are going to be talking one more time, or at least I'm going to be doing one more panel over the next month or so. And I also just wanted to give one last plug. I definitely follow Forbes's Blockchain 50. You will see Hyperledger members represented in large number there. You'll also see fascinating projects from other code bases and other repositories. But yeah, it's been fun to follow. Looking forward to following for another 5 years.
Well, Michael, thank you for being such a fair and accurate chronicler of everything going on in our community. We really appreciate it. And the blockchain Forbes 50 is like a huge calling card for us. So we're in a world where we don't have the metrics of coin market cap telling us, to 10 decimal points.
Next year, you're going to see data that you have never had before from the list. We're going to go really deep with the data this year. I think or next year. So there should be a lot of fun for a lot of people to go through.
It'd be great. Well, thank you, Michael. And thank you everyone else for participating and asking some really good questions. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.